This is why people hate government and don't trust government.
That number is one that we're still looking at.
You don't have any idea.
No, Senator.
You don't have anybody at the Bureau that can count.
I do not have that number in front of me today.
So let me get
Senator.
this straight. The First Step Act was passed in 2018. This is 2024. Am I right so far?
That's correct.
That's 6 years. And in 6 years, you've let 30,000 criminals go, right?
That's correct.
And you don't have the slightest idea how many of them committed another crime and came back.
I don't have that number in front of me today,
And you
sir.
run the Bureau of Prisons.
That's correct.
And how many employees do you have?
About 40,000 employees.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
Senator Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, how are you?
I'm doing well. Good to see you
Good.
again, Senator.
I'm a big fan. Director Peters, you're the director of the Bureau of Prisons, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
You used to run the correction system in Oregon, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Oregon legalized drugs, is that right?
That's correct.
Oregon's about to reverse that, is that correct?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the policy proposed to reverse that.
Oh, you've just ignored Oregon?
Oregon still has a very special place in my heart, sir.
Okay. You haven't read any of the articles about the reversal?
I haven't, Senator.
You don't know anything about it?
Correct, sir.
Okay, wow. You're in charge of implementing the First Step Act, Director?
That's correct.
How many criminals have you released under the First Step Act?
So First Step Act for the overall release since the initiation of the First Step Act is, I have that exact number in front of me.
You don't know off
Thought
the
I
top
did.
of your head?
Sorry, Senator. So 70% of those that were released, we have about 30,000 individuals that have been released since the passage of the First Step Act.
All right, so you've released 30,000 criminals under the First Step Act. Okay? And how many of them, before you released them, did you contact any of their victims to say we're about to let this guy out?
Senator, it's my understanding that that notification happens through the U.S. Attorney's Office, but I will check into that and get back to you.
You don't know?
Senator, I don't.
Have you followed up with the U.S. attorneys to say, do you have a system to say, hey, we're about to let this guy out? Would we want to be sure the victim's contacted?
As a former victims advocate, I share that value, that victim notification should happen. I'll check on the process and I'll
But
get
you
back
don't
to
know if it's happening.
That's correct, Senator.
Wow. Okay, of the 30,000 criminals you let free, how many of them have come back? Have committed a crime again, hurt somebody else?
So that number is one that we're still looking at as it relates to the recidivism rate for those that were released on the First Step Act.
You don't have any idea?
No, Senator.
You don't have anybody at the Bureau that can count?
I do not have that number in front of me today.
So let me get
Senator.
this straight. The First Step Act was passed in 2018. This is 2024. Am I right so far?
That's correct.
That's 6 years. And in 6 years, you've let 30,000 criminals go, right?
That's correct.
And you don't have the slightest idea how many of them committed another crime and came back.
I don't have that number in front of me today,
And you
sir.
run the Bureau of Prisons.
That's correct.
And how many employees do you have?
About 40,000 employees.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. General, I know you got a lot to do, but could you give us a hand here? And let's find out whether the First Step Act worked. And how many, if we've released 30,000 criminals after 6 years, our director here doesn't know how many have committed another crime and come back? Can you help us?
Senator, I can certainly follow up on that issue. I will just say in terms of work we've done in the past, for example, on compassionate release, and going to the Bureau of Prisons, this is before Director Peters was there, and asking them for data on compassionate release, because that was one of the issues that has come up.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I'm not talking about compassionate release.
No, I understand.
You know,
I'm
my
just saying-
colleague said, we were told that it would save money and it would be in the interest of public safety to release criminals from prison. I didn't vote for it, but the majority rules. And so Congress did it. And Ms. Peters, Director Peters at the Bureau of Prisons, and her colleagues released 30,000 criminals, all of whom are there for a reason, okay? They didn't just go to prison for a free toaster. They were there for a reason. And so her department let them go, and after 6 years, we don't have the slightest idea, not a single one of the 40,000 of her employees know how many have committed a second crime and come back. So how the hell are we supposed to figure out whether it worked? Your people ought to hide their head in a bag, Director, that you can't come here in front of this Congress and answer that question. I'm sorry, I interrupted you with my speech.
No, that's okay. I was just going to, my bottom line point on it was, I've often looked to those questions on things like compassionate release and other programs. And one of the challenges we found is the department just doesn't have good data on that. Halfway houses. Congress is spending about $500 million a year on halfway houses. There's really not great recidivism data on that either. How well are they working?
Before we do this, we need to find out. Look, I believe in justice. I believe in treating everybody fairly. But there are people out there, I don't know why, if I make it to heaven, I'm going to ask. They're not mixed up. They're not confused. They're not sick. It's not that their mama or daddy didn't love them or not enough. They just hurt other people, and they take other people's stuff, and we have to separate them from society. And the director let 30,000 of these folks go and can't tell me today how many have come back. I just find it takes my breath away. With 40,000 people. How many of your 40,000 people are actually coming to work or are still working from home, Director?
The supermajority of our employees come to work every day because we're running 24/7
What percentage are coming to work every day?
The percentage is quite high. I don't have the exact
You
number.
don't know?
But
Well, maybe there's your problem.
the supermajority of our individuals come to
If
work
they're not coming
at
to
our
work, they
institutions.
can't give us the answer. I've gone over. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. This is why people hate government and don't trust government.
Thank you.
Senator Cotton?
Director Peters, the Inspector General noted in his statement for today's hearing that solving the Bureau's staffing shortage is, quote, one of the building blocks to begin to address the chronic challenges facing the BOP. He also said that significant staffing shortages have had a, quote, cascading effect on your Bureau's facilities. When you testified 6 months ago, I asked you how many correctional officer positions were filled. You didn't have an answer at the time. Last month, you did an interview with 60 Minutes. You also didn't have an answer. Do you have an answer today for how many correctional officers you currently have on payroll?
Yes, Senator. We have almost 40,000 authorized positions across the organization, and 14,899 of those are correctional officers. We are going to 100% fund those positions. They are only 82% filled at this time.
14,899 are correctional officers.
Yes, correctional
And-
officers, the individuals that you would
Yes.
think in your mind are on the units safeguarding our adults in custody.
And you said 40,000. That's your total personnel, right?
That's our total.
What are you
personnel.
authorized and funded for by Congress for correctional officers?
For correctional officers, we are authorized at that 14,899 number, and it's 100% funded.
Are you sure you're not authorized around about 20,000?
20,000 is the correctional officer series position. That's 20,466. That includes correctional officers, lieutenant, correctional services officers, which are in our receiving and discharging unit, and also that number includes correctional counselors.
Okay. 14,899 is what you have today. Do you know what you had 6 months ago?
No, Senator, I don't have that number.
Do you know how many new officers have been hired over the last 6 months, new correctional officers?
I know that we've made progress in the last year. We have moved our overall recruitment and retention from 87% last year to 90%. We moved our correctional officer fill from the 70s into 82, about 82% now.
Okay. In 2022, the Congress passed a law requiring that your employees spend 90% of their time on their primary responsibility. So a correctional officer spends 90% of his time being a correctional officer. An HVAC technician spends 90% of his time doing HVAC work. The Bureau hasn't complied with that law, to my knowledge. 6 months ago when you were here, I asked how much time your employees are spending on average on their primary responsibility. Didn't have an answer. Do you have an answer for that today?
I do, Senator, and it's different in every institution. In some of our institutions, we'll take USP Thompson right now because we've been able to lower the number of, lower the mission. We needed fewer employees, and so we're not relying on augmentation and overtime. When you look at Brooklyn, we are relying on it substantially because of the lack of staffing. Many of my officers are working 16 hours regularly, and we're having to engage in augmentation on a daily basis at that institution, which, as you well know, while those psychologists or teachers, whomever is being augmented, is fully trained and prepared to do that work, it also means that they're not able to do their current job, as you're alluding to.
Yeah. So I take your point that you could average across all of your facilities, but that average is not particularly meaningful because each facility is its own world, and a facility that is well-balanced is going to have everyone doing 90% of their job, whether it's HVAC or teacher or counselor or correctional officer. Another facility might be unbalanced and rely heavily on augmentation and overtime. Is that right?
That's correct,
Okay.
Senator. And in those facilities where we are fully staffed or more full staff, we've just given clear direction to those wardens to begin over-hiring so that if they're in an economy where we're actually able to bring in correctional officers, we'll hire them and then we'll TDY them to some of these other institutions that are in more dire straits.
Okay. But based on your answer, I assume you know the answer on a facility-by-facility basis. You have that data available to you?
That's correct, Senator.
Is that data public in any of your published reports?
I will have to check on that and see.
If it's not, if it is, please send us the link. If it's not, could we get that data for
We will work with
the
your
committee?
staff to see
Thank
what
you.
we can share. Yes, Senator.
I want to talk briefly about challenges staffing up. Your correctional officers start out at the GS5 salary level, making $48,000 a year. My understanding is they can top out at $74,000 a year. By contrast, Border Patrol officers can start as high as $68,000, and they can top out at $113,000, even without becoming a supervisor. Does the Bureau have trouble competing with the pay of other federal law enforcement agencies?
It's great trouble competing with other law enforcement agencies. I'll pick on Brooklyn again. As we look at state corrections in New York, individuals can make 2 or 3 times more working for the New York City Corrections Department than the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So even after we issued a 35% retention bonus at Brooklyn, that allows someone after a few years to be making $90,000 a year. For state corrections in the same time period to be making about $130,000 a year.
In the last major appropriations bill that Congress passed in December 2022, Congress asked the Bureau to consider increasing pay to match those other agencies and asked for a review to be submitted no later than last June. Has that review been submitted yet?
Senator, I don't know. I can check. I will tell you that this year I was able to increase the base salary of correctional officers by $2,000. I didn't have the authority to go beyond that.
Okay. Please do and get back to us. One final point, since you and Mr. Horowitz both raised it about contraband in prisons. I think like maybe the most dangerous kind of contraband in prisons is cell phones. Cell phones aren't going to kill anyone themselves, but they enable the commission of many other heinous crimes in prison. That's one reason why I've introduced the Cell Phone Jamming Reform Act, which would make it clear to state prisons that they can use targeted jamming to block cell phone signals in prison housing units. We've had some resistance from the telecom industry. I wish they would come to their senses on this issue. But Ms. Peters, have you conducted pilot programs in your facilities on microjamming and managed access systems?
We have, Senator, at a variety of our institutions, both in terms of detection and jamming. Both prove very successful. What my employees are telling me is the detection versus the jamming is the most helpful because then we can investigate, figure out who actually has it, who brought it in, and solve the greater flow of the contraband problem.
Okay, and Mr. Horowitz, since you addressed the issue, would you like to make any comment on cell phones in
Yeah,
prisons based on your work?
Senator, couldn't agree more. I often say a cell phone in a prison is a deadly weapon. We investigated a murder for hire carried out on a federal correctional officer in Guaynabo, Puerto Rico, where the hit was put on by someone in the prison. And one of the things I've asked for, and I'd be happy to work with you, Senator, on this, smuggling a cell phone into a prison is a federal misdemeanor. It's not a felony. And that, I was surprised by that, frankly. Having been in AUSA for many years, I assumed, of course, it had to be a felony. It isn't. And what we found, by the way, I'm going to tie contraband to sexual assault. As you know, we have a major problem with sexual assaults in prison, not just on female inmates, obviously on female inmates, but also on male inmates. And one of the things we found is that contraband is used to groom inmates. It's the way to gain favor by a correctional officer or BOP employee. It's not just correctional officer, BOP employee, to gain favor. We prosecuted a chaplain in a federal facility in New Hampshire for bringing in contraband, cell phones, and other items. So that is something, we shouldn't have to make the bribery case, which is what we have to do to bring the felony charge, as you know as a former prosecutor. That's what we strive to do. But finding the person with the contraband, it's a lot easier to make those cases. We get a lot more prosecuted and get a lot of the very small fraction of BOP staff who are engaged in misconduct out. Because the other thing I know, I met with President White the other day. I know this from my time as a prosecutor in New York, where I prosecuted some corrupt police officers. There is not a single BOP employee who wants to work next to a corrupt employee or a dangerous inmate, right, who's engaging in crimes. So we all have to focus on that.
All right, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Booker is first.
I hate to distract from my questions, but I just want to defend the bipartisan work that we all did. 86 senators voted for it, and the dramatic drop in recidivism rates that is not the Bureau of Prisons' job to track, it's the Justice Department's job to track it, is stunning. I mean, this has literally saved the United States of America hundreds of millions of dollars. It has lowered crime. The data shows we max people out in prison, don't prepare them. You can't keep them by law. So when people max out and don't have halfway houses, don't have the kind of resources that people that were released during this have, their recidivism rates are through the charts. So we have to be smart on crime. And one of the biggest growths of bureaucracy I've seen in my life is a prison industrial complex in the United States of America, and it's not making us safer. So I understand that. And then the second thing, in your defense, the mission of the BOP is not to necessarily track folks after they're gone. From what I understand, having done a lot of reading and prep for a later hearing, that's not your mission. Your mission is to hold them securely, prepare them, programs, so forth. So if we want to get Senator Kennedy, if we want to get the head of the Justice Department, I'm all for grilling them, but you're one of these folks that we're giving you too little resources to do too much work. And that's what I'd like to jump into. And I have a lot of frustrations, obviously, with what's going on, but I've watched you now as a professional struggle mightily to meet the demands that are put on you in a moment where Congress is not giving you the resources necessary to do your job even. In facilities that are outrageously decrepit. I mean, your FY22 is estimated that the BOP needs $2 billion in funding to repair facilities, but the BOP, this is my challenge to you, has requested $200 million for infrastructure repairs. Congress allocated $59 million, but is it not true that people are dying in your facilities because there's no air conditioning?
Senator, your data points around the maintenance and repair backlog are absolutely spot on, and that number has grown since we last reported that $2 billion. It is now closer to $3 billion because we continue to have roofs that are crumbling. We continue to have HVACs that have stopped working. And if you look at the amount of money that we typically get from Congress, it's about $100,000 a year to solve that $3 billion problem, and the cost of one roof replacement alone is $1 million.
Yeah, and I just point this out to say again, this is a pattern here. your employees could literally leave your job and not make 10% more, 20% more, but 100% more, and not have to work hours. And you know this, and I'm going to bring this out in the hearing later on today. When you have to hold somebody over on a shift, what does that do to a family suddenly where they can't pick up their kids for school?
Senator, I hear it all the time when I'm walking the halls of our institutions. It isn't just the physical wear and tear and mental wear and tear of that overtime and augmentation. It is what impacts their
Yeah,
family.
I talked to the Capitol Police when we had them working, held over on shifts. They just weren't allowed to leave. And now suddenly their whole family is in crisis.
That's right. We hear all the time. They had their week planned out on who was picking the kids up from daycare, who was cooking, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons messes with that schedule day in and day out for our families.
Yeah, and we preach how much we support law enforcement. This is utterly shameful. A February 2024 GEO report found that by October 2023, the BOP housed approximately 8% of its prison population in solitary confinement. One of the things I'd like for you to address is the report noted significant racial disparities, with Black individuals comprising less than half, 38% of the total federal prison population, but represented over half, 59% of those in solitary. Can you address that for me?
Yes, Senator, and this is an issue that's been studied across the country, both in federal corrections and in state corrections. And often what we find is the level of gang activity that happens inside our institutions often drives that number. That's still unacceptable to me. I think we have so much work to do in restrictive housing reform, and we have to ask those hard questions about the disproportionate number of individuals of minority status who are in restrictive housing.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that's something my staff can work with you on as well. And then the final thing I just want to say is the chairman said it. I think there's room for a lot of bipartisan work here to try to address these issues. The shamefulness of what's happening as a result of the lack of funding for facilities, for personnel, and for certain position line items is outrageous implications of the United States of America and its support of law enforcement officers and creating inhumane conditions in prisons. The one thing the very small point to the Inspector General that was brought out, and I want to talk to Senator Cotton, who I'm going to be sitting with, chairing and is the ranking on this committee, is this idea of the inability to jam cell phone signals, and the fact that it's a misdemeanor to bring in something that you said under oath is a tantamount to a deadly weapon. And I'm wondering, number one, on the jamming issue, the only pushback my staff could say that they get is the need for federal public defenders when meeting with their client to be able to access the internet. Is there a workaround that you see to that concern? And then number two, do you think it would be enough of a deterrent if it was suddenly not a misdemeanor but a felony?
Yes, Senator. I think on both those issues, there's certainly a workaround. I think one of the issues, I think Senator Cotton had it right, the FCC and the technology companies have opposed it or raised concerns about it, in part because of the inability I think, and Director Peters can speak to this as well, to limit the jamming or limit the interference to the grounds itself of the facility, as opposed to some of the perimeter areas, particularly where there are homes nearby. And so I think those are some of the issues that have been at issue here. But many state prisons have been doing this for years. California has been involved in jamming technology. We've done work in this space, our office, over the years, and have seen other states successfully do it. So it's clearly doable. We're glad to see the BOP moving forward, but there are some areas they have to be careful about.
But the misdemeanor to the felony.
But the misdemeanor, yeah.
I mean, if somebody is caught sneaking a cell phone in, they're fired, right? They lose their job. Is that not enough of a deterrent?
Well, here's the issue. From a union standpoint, if they're a union member, there is an ability to litigate that question on a misdemeanor. A felony charge, if someone's convicted of a felony charge, my understanding is they're out. My understanding is if it's a misdemeanor or never prosecuted, and as you know, if it's only a misdemeanor, federal prosecutors are not taking these cases. So no one's getting prosecuted for a misdemeanor, right? There's lots of felonies to be prosecuted. So the problem is they're not being prosecuted, and that leaves it to the BOP's administrative process only to deal with the problem.
Yes.
And that sometimes does not, as I understand it, result in removal of individuals. And I have multiple examples, I'm happy to come speak to your staff about them and to you as well, where we have had cases involving sexual assaults that were the result of some grooming, bringing in food's a misdemeanor. Well, think about how that's an enticement to female inmates potentially, and a grooming tool.
And
It
I'll
just
just-
shouldn't happen.
No, I agree with you. And not to be a little lighthearted on this, but I want you to clarify for the record, when you say that nobody is prosecuted for federal misdemeanors, that's not an invitation to anybody on this dais
Correct.
to commit misdemeanors. It's-
I am, you are correct, and there are rare occasions where there are misdemeanor charges brought, but almost every U.S. Attorney's office in the country has lots of felony cases. to
Because
do with
Senator
that.
Durbin's staff, I just want to make sure they heard that. They should not do federal misdemeanors. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for the help, Senator.